3 pages. That is all it took. 3 pages of handwritten notes compiled by a single British intelligence analyst sitting in a converted Victorian office building on the south bank of the Thames, cross-referencing open-source Soviet military journals, defector debriefs, and a handful of grainy photographs taken through the windscreen of a mud-splattered car somewhere near Magdeburg in East Germany. 3 pages that described, with a precision the CIA's entire analytical apparatus had failed to achieve in 18 months of trying, the exact composition, disposition, and combat readiness of the Soviet group of forces Germany, the most powerful concentration of armor and artillery on Earth. The American liaison officer who received the document sat with it for a long time before he picked up the telephone. When he finally got through to his counterpart at Langley, he said 4 words that would quietly reshape the entire Anglo-American intelligence relationship for the next 3 decades. How did you know? The answer to that question is a story about how Britain, a nation that had spent itself to near-ruin fighting 2 world wars in 30 years and entered the Cold War with a defense budget that barely stretched to keep its aging aircraft carriers afloat, managed to produce a picture of Soviet military power that was more accurate, more detailed, and more analytically rigorous than anything the most expensive intelligence organization in human history could generate. It is a story about what happens when you take the accumulated analytical tradecraft of 6 centuries of European power politics, combine it with the institutional memory of men who had personally interrogated Wehrmacht generals and walked the smoldering ruins of Berlin in 1945, and point it at the single most important intelligence target of the 20th century. It is a story about a man named Kenneth Strong, and it begins not in the Cold War, but in the final days of the one that preceded it. The Western world in 1945 had just finished dismantling a continental military empire built on the most precise order of battle analysis in military history. Germany's Wehrmacht had been so thoroughly mapped by Allied intelligence that by the spring of 1945, British and American analysts could predict with reasonable confidence which panzer divisions would contest which river crossings, which SS units were combat effective, and which had been burned down to shadows by years of attrition on the Eastern Front, and which German commanders were likely to fight to the last and which would surrender at the first reasonable offer. This knowledge had not fallen from the sky. It had been built painstakingly over years by men and women who understood that an army is not merely a number. It is an organism. It has habits, preferences, weaknesses, and characteristic behaviors that can be read by a trained analyst the way a physician reads a patient's symptoms. The British had been reading armies since Wellington's intelligence officers mapped Napoleon's dispositions before Waterloo. By 1945, they had brought the discipline to its highest point. Then victory arrived, and almost immediately a new problem came into focus. The Soviet Union that emerged from the Second World War as America's partner in victory was also, simultaneously, its most dangerous potential adversary. And unlike Germany, which had been a known entity, an industrial power whose factories, rail networks, and military doctrine had been studied for decades, the Soviet Union was opaque in ways that almost defied description. Stalin's state was a closed society sealed behind borders that the NKVD enforced with lethal consistency. Soviet military doctrine was published in journals that reached the West only rarely and in fragments. Soviet industry was dispersed and hidden. Soviet military units moved under conditions of secrecy that made the Wehrmacht's operational security look casual. And the Soviet armed forces, by the late 1940s, numbered in the millions, deployed across a continental landmass stretching from the Elbe River in central Germany to the Pacific coast of Siberia. Understanding that force, its actual size, its actual readiness, its actual intentions, was the central intelligence problem of the age. The Americans approached this problem with money. The Central Intelligence Agency, formally established in 1947 under the National Security Act, was given a budget and a mandate that dwarfed anything Britain could contemplate. By the early 1950s, the CIA was running agent networks across Eastern Europe, funding émigré organizations, establishing listening posts from Turkey to Norway, and beginning the development of the technical collection platforms that would ultimately include the U-2 reconnaissance aircraft and a succession of orbital surveillance satellites. The scale was extraordinary. The ambition was without limit. And for the first several years of the Cold War, the results were profoundly disappointing. Not because the Americans lacked capability or commitment, but because the Soviet target was designed from the ground up to defeat exactly the kind of intelligence collection the Americans were attempting. Agent networks were penetrated and rolled up with monotonous regularity. Émigré organizations were riddled with Soviet informants. Electronic signals were encrypted or simply not generated. And the vast interior of the Soviet Union, where divisions and armies and entire fronts were organized and equipped and trained, was invisible to everything except the highest-flying aircraft and the early limited satellite systems that could photograph territory but could not read the minds of the generals commanding it. Britain, by contrast, approached the problem with something different. It approached it with people. In 1946, the year before the CIA was even formally constituted, Major General Kenneth Strong sat down in London and began designing what would become the most systematically rigorous military intelligence analytical organization in the Western world. Strong was not an ordinary man. He was, by the end of the war, one of the most experienced intelligence officers alive, having served as General Dwight Eisenhower's chief intelligence officer for the entire Northwest European campaign from the Normandy landings through to the German surrender. He had personally received and assessed the intelligence that warned of the German offensive in the Ardennes in December 1944. A warning that was partially discounted by commanders who did not believe the Germans had the strength to mount a major counterattack and which, when the attack came, validated everything Strong's analysts had concluded. He had sat across negotiating tables from Wehrmacht generals and understood at a visceral level that no amount of satellite imagery could replicate how military organizations thought, planned, and deceived. He knew that an army reveals itself not primarily through what it broadcasts, but through what it does. Through its logistics patterns, its training cycles, its equipment maintenance schedules, its command personnel rotations, and the 10,000 small operational habits that accumulate into something an experienced analyst can read like a fingerprint. Strong called his new organization the Joint Intelligence Bureau. It was established under the British Ministry of Defense with a remit to produce all-source intelligence assessments on foreign military capabilities, with a particular focus on the Soviet Union and what would increasingly be called the Warsaw Pact. The JIB was not primarily a collection organization, it was an analytical one. Its task was not to steal secrets, but to understand them. To take the fragments of information that arrived from every direction, the defector debriefs and the signals, intercepts, and the photographs and the military attaché reports and the open-source Soviet publications, and to assemble them with methodical analytical rigor into a coherent picture of what the Soviet military actually looked like, actually comprised, and actually intended. To understand why this mattered, it is necessary to understand what the phrase order of battle actually means. An order of battle is not simply a list of units. It is, when properly constructed, a complete description of a military force as a functioning system. It shows the hierarchical organization, the command structure, the personnel strength, the equipment holdings, the logistical sustainability, the training status, and the geographic disposition of every significant military formation down to battalion level or below. A complete, accurate order of battle for the Soviet forces in Europe was worth more than any single agent, more than any single signals intercept, more than any individual piece of technical intelligence, because it was the analytical framework that made every other piece of intelligence interpretable. Without it, raw data was noise. With it, every new fragment of information could be slotted into a structure that revealed not just what a unit was, but what it was capable of and what it was likely to do. Building this picture of the Soviet military was the central analytical challenge of the Cold War. And the JIB, under Strong and his successors, began building it from the moment the organization was created. The foundation of the JIB's approach was what could be called the doctrine of systematic patience. The Americans, under constant political pressure to produce assessments that would drive policy decisions, tended to work from the top down, identifying the most pressing intelligence questions, tasking collection systems against them, and attempting to produce answers on timelines driven by the policy process rather than the intelligence cycle. The British worked from the bottom up. They began with what was known with certainty and built outward from there, accumulating detail, cross-referencing every new piece of information against the existing analytical framework, and never claiming certainty they did not possess. Strong had watched too many intelligence failures born from premature certainty to fall into that trap. He built a culture of analytical caution that was sometimes maddening to the Americans, who wanted confident assessments with clean headlines, but which, over time, produced assessments that held up under scrutiny in ways that more aggressively produced analysis often did not. The men who built this culture were themselves products of a specific kind of British military and academic experience. Many had come from the wartime intelligence services, bringing with them the habits of mind that Bletchley Park and its successor organizations had cultivated: the ability to sit with uncertainty, the discipline to distinguish between what the evidence showed and what the analyst suspected, the intellectual honesty to acknowledge gaps in knowledge rather than filling them with assumption. These were not heroic qualities in the Hollywood sense. They would not get a man killed behind enemy lines, and they would not produce the kind of dramatic intelligence coup that ended up on a president's desk with a cover note reading "urgent." But they produced something more valuable and more durable. They produced accurate pictures. The engine that drove those pictures was britishsas. The British commander's in-chief mission to the Soviet forces in Germany was, in formal terms, a liaison organization. It had been established in September 1946 under the Robertson-Malinin Agreement, which created a framework for military missions to operate in each other's occupation zones in Germany, as a mechanism for maintaining contact between the occupying powers. The Soviets got SOXMAS, their equivalent mission operating in the British zone. The British got britishsas, operating in the Soviet zone. Both sides understood perfectly well that the liaison rationale was a diplomatic convenience. The actual purpose of britishsas was intelligence collection, and it was, for the better part of 4 decades, the single most productive ground-level intelligence collection program the British ever ran. britishsas operated from a mission house in Potsdam, inside the Soviet zone, where East German Stasi surveillance was constant, and the housekeeping staff were reliably assumed to be reporting every conversation overheard in the building to Soviet counterintelligence. The mission teams understood this and operated accordingly. The actual intelligence work happened in the field, during what britishsas called car tours. Teams of 3, typically an officer, a non-commissioned officer, and a driver, would leave the mission house in civilian vehicles and spend between 2 and 5 days driving through the Soviet zone, penetrating restricted military areas, photographing Soviet equipment, recording unit insignia and vehicle markings, counting tanks on tank parks, measuring antenna configurations, and building, piece by piece, the most granular possible picture of the Soviet military presence in East Germany. The mission ran approximately 6 tours per week throughout its operational existence. Over 43 years, that added up to an incomprehensibly large body of direct observation that no satellite system, however sophisticated, could replicate, because satellites cannot smell diesel exhaust, cannot hear the particular engine signature of a T-72 tank, and cannot read the hand-stenciled unit markings on a fuel truck parked at the edge of a Soviet motor pool at 3 in the morning. The teams that ran these tours were selected and trained with a rigor that reflected the stakes involved. The Soviet zone was not a permissive environment. Soviet and East German forces could, and regularly did, physically interfere with britishsas tours, ramming vehicles, detaining personnel, seizing film, and on at least one occasion fatally shooting a mission member. Major Arthur Nicholson was shot and killed by a Soviet sentry in March 1985 while conducting a tour near a Soviet military installation. He died on the ground while Soviet military personnel, in a deliberate act of political intimidation, prevented a U.S. military physician from providing medical assistance for over an hour. His death was a reminder that the intelligence work being done by britishsas was not an academic exercise. It was contested, dangerous, and operationally consequential at the highest level. What britishsas produced, fed back to the JIB and later the Defense Intelligence Staff in London, was raw observational data of a quality that no technical collection system of the era could match. The photographs and vehicle counts and unit identifications came back to analysts who then cross-referenced them against every other available source. Defector debriefs, Soviet military journal articles, GCHQ signals intercepts, reports from military attachés in Moscow. Oleg Penkovsky's extraordinary intelligence contribution in the early 1960s, which included over 5,000 photographs of classified Soviet military documents, added layers of detail about Soviet doctrine, organization, and command structure that simply had not existed before. The picture grew denser and more accurate with every passing year. The Americans had access to much of this material through the UQSA Intelligence Sharing Agreement and the broader Five Eyes Partnership. But the analytical culture that produced British assessments was not exportable. It lived in the minds of the analysts who had built it, and it expressed itself most clearly in the moments when the British and American assessments of the same target diverged. Those moments of divergence are where the story becomes most instructive. In the late 1950s and into the early 1960s, the dominant analytical narrative in Washington about Soviet military power was one of overwhelming and rapidly growing strength. The missile gap, as it became known in American political discourse, held that the Soviet Union was producing long-range ballistic missiles at a rate that would soon give it decisive strategic superiority over the United States. This assessment drove defense spending, shaped arms control policy, and featured prominently in the 1960 presidential election, where John Kennedy used it as a cudgel against the Eisenhower administration. The missile gap was, as subsequent intelligence assessments confirmed once U-2 imagery and eventually satellite photography revealed the actual state of Soviet missile forces, almost entirely fictional. The Soviet strategic rocket forces were far smaller and far less capable than the American assessments had claimed. The United States was not behind in the strategic competition. It was, in most measurable dimensions, substantially ahead. The British had never fully embraced the missile gap thesis. The JIB's assessments of Soviet strategic capabilities had consistently been more conservative than the American estimates, not because the British had better collection against Soviet missile programs, but because British analysts were more rigorous about distinguishing between what the evidence showed and what the worst-case assumptions suggested. They understood from years of watching the Soviet military as a whole system that the Soviets faced the same constraints that every military organization faces: manpower, industrial capacity, logistics, training time, the physics of concrete and steel, and engineering tolerances that set real upper limits on how fast even the most determined state could build a strategic missile force. The British looked at what the Soviets had demonstrated they could do and were skeptical of assessments that attributed to them capabilities they had not yet shown. This skepticism turned out to be correct. The same pattern repeated itself in the assessment of Soviet conventional forces in Europe, which was the area where British analytical advantages were most pronounced and most consequential. The central question for NATO war planning throughout the Cold War was straightforward and terrifying. If the Soviets decided to invade Western Europe, how long would it take before they reached the Rhine? Everything else in NATO strategy, force levels, nuclear doctrine, reinforcement timelines depended on the answer to that question. and the answer depended on an accurate assessment of Soviet and Warsaw Pact ground force capabilities, which in turn depended on an accurate order of battle. The British order of battle for the Soviet Group of Forces Germany, maintained by the Defense Intelligence Staff and fed by britishsas tours and GCHQ intercepts and every other available source, was not a static document. It was a living analytical product that was constantly updated, refined, and tested against new information. British analysts knew which Soviet divisions were deployed in East Germany. They knew their equipment scales, their manpower strengths, their logistical supply arrangements, the locations of their ammunition dumps and fuel depots, the identities of their senior commanders, and the operational styles of those commanders, which had been studied through years of observing Soviet exercises. They knew the maintenance status of Soviet tank fleets, not from any single source, but from the accumulation of britishsas tour reports that had counted serviceable versus unserviceable vehicles on tank parks across the Soviet zone for years. They knew the Soviet logistical system's dependence on rail transport and the choke points in that rail network where interdiction would bite earliest and hardest. This knowledge was not flashy. It did not produce dramatic intelligence coups. It was the product of decades of patient, systematic work by people whose names appeared in no headlines and whose contributions received no public acknowledgement. But it was, in the assessment of every serious analyst who has examined the Cold War intelligence record, more accurate in its core judgments about Soviet conventional military capability than the American estimates produced during the same period. The reason for this difference is not flattering to the Americans, and it took some years after the Cold War ended and the Soviet archives became partially accessible before the full extent of the divergence became clear. American assessments of Soviet conventional forces had, for much of the Cold War, tended to overestimate Soviet capability in ways that were systematically skewed in a single direction. They overestimated the readiness of Soviet formations that intelligence later revealed were chronically undermanned and poorly maintained. They overestimated the sustainability of Soviet logistics systems that were, in practice, dependent on wartime requisition of civilian transport, in ways that would have created enormous operational friction in the opening days of a real conflict. And they overestimated the quality of Warsaw Pact Allied forces, the East German, Polish, Czech, and Hungarian armies that were nominally part of the Soviet military coalition, but whose actual reliability in a conflict against their West European neighbors was, at best, deeply uncertain. The British were more cautious on all of these questions, not because they had better raw intelligence on every point, but because they had spent longer looking at the Soviet military as a whole system and had developed a more nuanced understanding of the gap between what a military organization claims it can do and what it can actually do under operational stress. Strong had seen that gap clearly in Germany's performance in 1944 and 1945, when Wehrmacht formations that looked formidable on paper dissolved under sustained pressure because the men were exhausted, the equipment was worn out, and the supply system had been bombed into dysfunction. He did not assume the Soviet military was immune to the same kinds of institutional friction that affected every large military organization. His successors inherited that instinct and applied it rigorously. The Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 provided the most dramatic single test of British intelligence's contribution to the management of the Cold War's most dangerous confrontation. The crisis itself was triggered by the discovery, through CIA U-2 reconnaissance flights, of Soviet medium-range ballistic missile sites under construction in Cuba. The discovery shocked Washington. The Kennedy administration had received explicit private assurances from Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrinin that no offensive weapons were being deployed to the island. The U-2 photographs showed that those assurances were lies. What followed was 13 days of the most intense crisis management in the history of nuclear deterrence, during which the world came closer to a thermonuclear exchange than any subsequent analysis has suggested the participants fully understood at the time. During those 13 days, British intelligence played a role that is less celebrated than it deserves. GCHQ's station at Scarborough had been monitoring Soviet naval communications as Soviet ships carrying the missile equipment steamed toward Cuba. And when the United States announced its naval quarantine of the island, it was GCHQ intercept analysis that provided the first reliable indication of how individual Soviet ships were responding to the quarantine line. The intercepts, which tracked the position and heading of Soviet vessels through their own radio communications, gave Washington advance notice of which ships were turning back and which were continuing to approach, intelligence that was transmitted directly to the White House Situation Room and that informed Kennedy's moment-by-moment management of the confrontation. The Soviets, sailing toward a quarantine enforced by the most powerful navy on Earth, were being tracked by British listeners on a cliff in Yorkshire. Kenneth Strong himself, at this point serving as the first director of the Defense Intelligence Staff following the 1964 reorganization that merged the JIB and the Service Intelligence Directorates into a unified analytical organization, was positioned at the heart of the Anglo-American intelligence exchange throughout the crisis. His access to both the British analytical product and the American intelligence machinery gave him a unique vantage point from which to assess the gap between what each side knew and what each side believed. The British assessment of Soviet resolve, based on years of systematic analysis of Soviet military doctrine and political decision-making patterns, was that Khrushchev had overreached and would accept a face-saving exit rather than risk a war the Soviet military was not genuinely prepared to fight. This assessment was more measured and, as events proved, more accurate than some of the more alarming American estimates that circulated during the crisis's most intense days. What the British possessed and what gave their assessments their particular quality was something that cannot be manufactured quickly or bought with larger budgets. It was institutional memory. The analysts who assessed the Soviet military in 1962 were the intellectual heirs of the people who had assessed the German military in 1942. They had access to a continuous analytical record stretching back to the early Cold War, maintained by people who understood not just the current state of Soviet forces, but the trajectory of their development, the rate at which they were changing, and the patterns of behavior that had remained consistent across different commanders and different political periods. This longitudinal perspective was invaluable because it allowed British analysts to distinguish between real changes in Soviet capability and mere changes in how the Soviets were presenting themselves. An army that suddenly begins claiming to have solved a logistical problem it has struggled with for years deserves skepticism. An army that demonstrates, through observable changes in its exercise patterns and its maintenance cycles, that it has actually solved a logistical problem deserves to be taken seriously. The British had been watching long enough to tell the difference. The analytical machinery that made all of this possible was, by American standards, remarkably spare. The Defense Intelligence Staff worked from buildings in London that were neither glamorous nor expensively equipped. The analytical teams were small by CIA standards, measured in dozens rather than hundreds. The technology available to them was less advanced, the budgets tighter, the overhead imagery allocation less generous. But the quality of the analysts selected for intellectual rigor and analytical depth rather than institutional loyalty or political alignment was consistently high. And the culture that Strong had established and his successors maintained, a culture that prized accuracy over certainty, that demanded that assessments be tested against evidence rather than driven by assumption, that treated the gap between what was known and what was suspected as something to be acknowledged rather than papered over, produced assessments that held up under scrutiny. The specific incident that gives this story its title belongs to a period in the late 1970s when the Defense Intelligence Staff's Order of Battle Branch was engaged in a sustained analytical effort to refine the British understanding of Soviet and Warsaw Pact force levels in Central Europe. A joint Anglo-American working group had been established to reconcile the different estimates being produced on the two sides of the Atlantic. a process that involved sharing both analytical conclusions and the raw intelligence sources underlying them. At one point in these discussions, a senior American analyst challenged the British figure for the total number of tank battalions in the Soviet group of forces Germany, arguing that the British number was lower than the American estimate, and that the American figure, derived from a particular signals intelligence assessment, was more likely to be accurate. The British analyst responsible for the order of battle assessment looked up from the document in front of him and said something that became, within the small world of Anglo-American defense intelligence exchange, something close to legend. He said, with the flat, undemonstrative certainty of a man who has spent years doing nothing else, that he had already counted them. Not counted the signals intercepts, not counted the data points in an analytical model. Counted the tank battalions. In the field, tour by tour, exercise by exercise, photograph by photograph, britishsas team by britishsas team, over years of direct observation. He knew the number because he had built the number from its constituent parts, and he was confident in it precisely because he could trace every element of it back to primary evidence that had been collected, verified, and cross-referenced with every other available source. The Americans, whose estimate was based primarily on signals analysis and model-driven extrapolation from incomplete collection, eventually revised their figure in the direction of the British assessment. When the Cold War ended and Soviet archival records became partially accessible, the actual Soviet order of battle in East Germany proved to be closer to the British figure than the American one. This kind of quiet vindication is not the stuff of films and television series. There was no dramatic confrontation, no single moment of revelation, no courier sprinting through checkpoints with documents that changed the world. The story of British Cold War intelligence is, in its essential character, a story about the cumulative power of systematic patience applied over decades to a problem of extraordinary difficulty by people who brought to it an analytical rigor inherited from the intelligence traditions of the Second World War, and a willingness to sit with uncertainty rather than resolve it prematurely into false confidence. The britishsas mission continued until October 1990, outlasting the Berlin Wall that had defined the political landscape it operated within. In its final years, as Soviet forces began their long withdrawal from East Germany following the collapse of the Warsaw Pact, britishsas teams documented the departure of the same formations they had spent decades monitoring, photographing Soviet armor loading onto trains, recording the dismantling of the most formidable military force ever deployed on European soil, building a last closing chapter in the analytical record they had maintained since 1946. The intelligence produced in those final months was itself historically significant, providing a real-time account of the end of the Soviet military presence in Central Europe that informed both British and American policy as the post-Cold War security architecture was being designed. The Defense Intelligence Staff's order of battle work was, throughout the Cold War, one of the least known and least celebrated achievements of British statecraft. The men and women who built those assessments, who spent careers studying the structure and capabilities of a military they hoped would never be used, operated in almost total obscurity. Their work appeared in classified documents distributed to NATO partners and to the highest levels of the British government. It informed alliance war planning, nuclear targeting doctrine, arms control negotiating positions, and the strategic judgments of every British Prime Minister from Clement Attlee to Margaret Thatcher. It was as consequential as any intelligence produced during the Cold War, and it was produced by a system that the Americans consistently underestimated for the same reason they consistently underestimated British capability more broadly. They measured it by the standards they understood. They measured it in budgets and headcounts and technical specifications. They did not measure it in the quality of the people, the depth of the analytical culture, or the weight of the institutional memory that those people carried. Kenneth Strong understood this from the beginning. He had watched in two theaters of the Second World War how intelligence quality was determined not by the resources devoted to collection, but by the rigor and experience of the people who analyzed what was collected. He had seen how the Americans, with their vastly greater resources, sometimes produced intelligence that was less actionable than what a small British team working the same problem could generate, because the Americans lacked the patient, systematic analytical approach that the British had developed over years of necessity. He built an organization designed to preserve and perpetuate that analytical approach, and he succeeded. The Cold War ended. The Soviet Union dissolved, the files were partially opened, and the assessments could at last be checked against the reality they had attempted to describe. The verdict was not that British intelligence had been perfect. No intelligence organization is perfect, and British Cold War intelligence had its share of failures, its penetrations and moles and analytical misjudgments that any honest accounting must include. But on the central question of the Cold War, the question of what the Soviet military actually was, what it was actually capable of, and what it was likely to actually do, the British assessments were, more often than not, closer to the truth than the American ones. Not because the British had more satellites, not because they had more money, or more analysts, or more technology, because they had started counting earlier, counted more carefully, and had the institutional discipline to trust their count, even when powerful voices on the other side of the Atlantic said the number was wrong. The American liaison officer who received those 3 pages and asked how the British knew already had his answer, though he may not have recognized it at the time. The answer was not a single source, not a single operation, not a single moment of analytical brilliance. The answer was 40 years of men in marked cars driving through the night in a country that wanted to catch them, of analysts in quiet rooms reading Soviet military journals line by line, of GCHQ linguists who had spent years learning to hear the difference between a formation conducting a routine exercise and a formation being readied for something else. The answer was the accumulation of all of that, built into an analytical product that was not flashy, was not dramatic, was not the kind of intelligence that gets written about in memoirs and turned into feature films. It was just accurate, and in the business of understanding the most dangerous military force in the history of the world, accuracy was everything. The officer who said he had already counted them was not boasting. He was describing a process that had taken decades, had cost careers, and in at least one case a life, and had produced a picture of Soviet military power that helped keep a Cold War cold. He had counted them, he knew the number, and the number was right. That is the story that has never been properly told, not because it lacks consequence, but because its consequence is expressed in the things that did not happen, the wars that were not fought, because the deterrent was correctly calibrated, the escalations that were not triggered because the intelligence was accurate enough to prevent a catastrophic misunderstanding of Soviet intent, the arms control agreements that were negotiated from a position of genuine knowledge rather than paranoid overestimation. These counterfactuals are difficult to see precisely because they succeeded. The best intelligence work of the Cold War left behind no visible record of its achievement, because its achievement was the absence of catastrophe. Kenneth Strong retired from the Defense Intelligence Staff in 1966. He died in 1982. The organization he built outlasted him by decades and outlasted the Cold War itself. Britishsas was formally disbanded on 2 October 1990 after 44 years of continuous operation. The Defense Intelligence Staff exists to this day, still doing the patient, systematic analytical work that Strong established as its founding principle. Somewhere in its archives there are the original Britishsas tour reports, hundreds of thousands of pages of field observations compiled by men who drove through Soviet military zones in the dark and wrote down everything they saw. There are the analytical files that translated those observations over years into the order of battle assessments that shaped British and NATO strategic planning throughout the Cold War. There are the cross-reference tables, and the source validation records, and the analytical conclusions that were arrived at by rigorous patient work rather than assumption or extrapolation. And somewhere in those files, there is almost certainly the document that prompted the question on the other side of the Atlantic, the 3 pages that described, with quiet precision, the exact composition of the most powerful army on Earth. He had already counted them. He knew the number was right. That is what it looks like when you build an intelligence organization around the quality of the people rather than the scale of the budget. That is what it looks like when you measure capability not in dollars spent, but in the depth of the analytical culture, the weight of the institutional memory, and the patient discipline to count the tanks one by one, year by year, tour by tour, until the picture is not suspected but known. The CIA had satellites. Britain had something older, quieter, and in the end, more reliable. It had analysts who understood that the most important question in intelligence is never, what do we think? It is always, how do we know? And when they could answer that question, when every element of the picture could be traced back to direct evidence verified against multiple independent sources, they spoke with a certainty that no amount of technology, however sophisticated, could replicate. Not because they were guessing correctly, but because they had stopped guessing years ago. They had already counted them.